Welcome to Women of Worth, the podcast where we talk about life's challenges and how to rise above them. Today we're discussing something many of us struggle with: how to forgive ourselves and move on. We've all made mistakes or faced moments we wish we could take back. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. But holding on to guilt or regret can keep us stuck, making it harder to grow and enjoy life. In today's episode, we'll explore why forgiving yourself is so important, the barriers that make it difficult, and simple steps to let go of the past and start fresh. If this topic speaks to you, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. What's something you've learned about forgiving yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can all learn and grow together. Let's get started on this journey of self-forgiveness and discover how you can move forward with peace and confidence.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at self-forgiveness, something I think a lot of us struggle with. And we're going to be diving deep into an article called Episode 20, How to Forgive Yourself and Move On for Women. And we're going to see what we can learn from it and how this can help us.
Yeah, self-forgiveness is really important. We don't always think about it, but that guilt can really weigh us down and affect everything from our stress to even like our relationships,
Yeah, and this article talks about how it affects like your mental health too. If you're not forgiving yourself, you are more likely to feel anxious or depressed. Even like your self-worth can really take a hit. But I think a lot of us, when we think about self-forgiveness, we're not exactly sure what that means.
Right. It's a little bit fuzzy. It's not about just saying like, oh, it doesn't matter or whatever happened didn't happen. Like it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah. So where do we even begin with this? The article talks about this woman, Jill, and she was feeling so guilty about ending a relationship. And it was a long-term relationship too, so I can only imagine how hard that must have been.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about Jill's story is it shows us that sometimes, trying your best means choosing what's best for you. Even if it's hard, even if it's difficult, choosing your own well-being is sometimes like the best thing you can do in a situation.
Okay, so that's a really good point. So if it's not just about ignoring the bad stuff, what does it actually look like to forgive yourself?
Well, the article breaks it down into 4 parts. The first one is acknowledgement. That's where you actually face what happened. You don't sugarcoat it or anything like that.
So you're not running away from it.
Right. And then the second part is responsibility. This is where you own up to the part that you played in what happened, but you don't let your actions define who you are as a person.
Right. So you're not saying, oh, it's not my fault, but you're also not saying like, oh, I'm a horrible person because of this one thing. What are the other 2 pieces?
So the third part is compassion, and this one's huge. Think about it this way. If your friend was in your shoes, would you just constantly be criticizing them? Probably not. So self-forgiveness means showing yourself that same understanding.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, what about the last part?
And finally, there's growth. This is where you look at your mistakes as opportunities to learn and grow so that you can make better choices next time.
I like that, turning a negative into a positive. And the article talks about Marie. She was struggling with guilt over telling someone a secret.
Yeah, and her story is such a good example of how those 4 parts work together. She admitted that she messed up and apologized, but she also recognized that everyone makes mistakes, and she focused on being a better friend moving forward.
Okay, so I'm getting the theory now, but how do we actually do this? Like, what are the actual steps to forgiving yourself?
Well, lucky for us, the article lays out 7 steps.
Okay, I'm ready to take notes.
So step 1 is to recognize and process those difficult emotions. A lot of times we try to just ignore those feelings of guilt, but that just makes it worse. It just festers.
So we shouldn't try to bury it.
Right. You have to name it. Say, I'm feeling guilty because, and then actually say the reason. You can journal about it, talk to a therapist, or even just a trusted friend.
Okay. And the article talks about Mona, who was feeling guilty for missing her kid's school play.
Yeah. And she ended up journaling about it and realized that it wasn't just about the play. Her guilt was tied to this bigger pattern of overcommitting herself and not setting boundaries.
So by actually acknowledging her emotions, she was able to figure out what was really bothering her.
Exactly.
Okay, so step 1 is being real with ourselves about how we feel.
Right. And then step 2 is about dealing with that negative self-talk. You know that voice in your head that says things like, You messed up, you're terrible.
Oh my gosh, I know that voice so well.
We all do. And that kind of talk just fuels the guilt.
So how do we quiet that voice?
Well, you can't really tell it to shut up, but you can reframe what it's saying. So instead of saying I'm a bad person, you can say I made a mistake, but I'm learning from it.
So you're changing the script.
Exactly.
But does that actually work?
Well, there's actually science behind this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is also called CBT, it focuses on changing these negative thought patterns, and it's been proven to reduce guilt.
So it's not just like a feel-good thing.
Right. It's a real strategy.
So step 1, we face the feelings. Step 2, we change how we talk to ourselves about it. What about step 3?
Step 3 is all about understanding the context. We have to remember that mistakes rarely happen in a vacuum. We need to think about what else was going on in our lives at the time. Like, were we under a lot of stress or pressure? Did we have all the information we needed?
So instead of just blaming ourselves, we're looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
And the article talks about Annie who yelled at her coworker.
Yeah, but when she really thought about it, she realized she was super stressed and overworked at the time.
So she was able to cut herself some slack.
Right.
Okay, so we've acknowledged our feelings, reframed the negative self-talk, and looked at the bigger picture. What's step 4?
Step 4 is about taking action by apologizing and making amends. If we've hurt someone, this step is really important for both their healing and our own.
So you're taking responsibility.
Exactly.
And the article gives the example of Lucy, who apologized to a friend for breaking her trust.
Right, and that apology wasn't just words, it was a commitment to rebuilding their friendship.
Okay, so sometimes forgiving ourselves means facing the people we've hurt and trying to make things right. What's next?
Step 5 is all about self-compassion. And this is probably the most important element of self-forgiveness.
Okay, I'm interested. Why is self-compassion so important?
Well, it's about recognizing that we're all imperfect, we all make mistakes, and that includes you.
That makes sense.
Would you be constantly criticizing a friend if they messed up?
Probably not.
But we do this to ourselves all the time. Self-compassion is about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a loved one.
Okay, so it's like being our own best friend. And this isn't just some fluffy feel-good idea. There's actually a researcher, Dr. Kristen Neff, and she studies self-compassion.
Yes, and her research has shown that self-compassion actually makes us more emotionally resilient.
So we can bounce back from setbacks more quickly.
Right.
Wow, so self-compassion is a superpower.
It really is.
Okay, so we've acknowledged our feelings, reframed our negative self-talk, considered the context, apologized, and practiced self-compassion. We've got 2 more steps to go.
We do.
I'm loving this deep dive.
Me too.
What's next?
So step 6 is all about focusing on growth, not perfection.
Okay, so we're not dwelling on what we did wrong. We're trying to learn from it.
Exactly. Instead of beating yourself up, you ask yourself, what did I learn from this experience? How can I use this to make better choices in the future?
So we're turning a negative into a positive.
Right.
I bet that really helps to lessen those feelings of guilt and regret.
It does. And the article talks about Daisy. She went through a really tough breakup, and it would have been so easy to just blame herself for everything.
Oh yeah, breakups are so hard. It's easy to get stuck in that cycle of what ifs and should haves.
But Daisy chose to focus on growth instead. She realized that she needed to work on communicating more honestly in her relationships, and that helped her move on without all that guilt and baggage.
That's a really inspiring example. Yep. Okay, so we've acknowledged our emotions, reframed our self-talk, considered the context, apologized, practiced self-compassion, and now we're focused on growth. What's the final step?
Step 7 is all about letting go. It's about releasing that guilt and embracing emotional freedom. Imagine you've been carrying this heavy backpack full of rocks, and each rock represents some guilt or regret you're holding on to.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can feel the weight of that backpack just thinking about it.
Letting go is like finally setting that backpack down and allowing yourself to stand up straight and breathe.
That sounds amazing. But how do we actually do that? How do we let go of something that we might have been carrying for years?
Well, there are some really powerful tools you can use. One is mindfulness, which is all about bringing your attention to the present moment without judgment. You let go of those thoughts that keep you stuck in the past.
Have you ever tried mindfulness exercises?
I have, and they can be really helpful. It's like training your mind to release those thoughts that keep you trapped in that cycle of guilt.
What about visualization? I've heard that can be really helpful for dealing with difficult emotions.
Visualization is a great tool. Imagine putting all of your guilt and regret into a box. You close the lid tightly, maybe even lock it, and then you picture yourself walking away from that box. And with every step you take, you feel lighter and freer.
I love that visual.
Yeah.
And there's actually science to back this up, right?
There is. Studies have shown that mindfulness can significantly reduce rumination, which is that tendency to replay negative thoughts over and over again.
So by quieting those thoughts, we create space for peace and clarity.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered all 7 steps. But before we move on, I'd love to go back to Jill and Marie's stories and see how these steps could apply to their specific situation. Let's start with Jill. She felt so guilty about ending her relationship, but she also knew that she needed to prioritize her own well-being. How could these steps help her find peace and move forward?
Well, first, she could try journaling or talking to a therapist to really process her emotions. Remember Mona? Maybe Jill will realize that her guilt is also tied to a larger pattern that needs to be addressed.
That's a good point. And then she could start to reframe her negative self-talk. Instead of thinking, I should have tried harder, she could try saying, I made the best decision I could with the information I had at the time.
Exactly. And it would also be helpful for her to really understand the context of her relationship. Maybe there were things that were happening that she wasn't fully acknowledging that could help her be less critical of herself.
It's about understanding that her decision to leave wasn't made in a vacuum.
Right. And even though apologizing to her ex might not be appropriate or helpful in this situation, she can still practice self-compassion. She can remind herself that it's okay to choose her own well-being and that making that choice doesn't make her a bad person.
And then she can focus on what she learned from the relationship and use those lessons to build healthier relationships in the future.
Right. And finally, she can use letting go practices like mindfulness or visualization. Imagine Jill sitting quietly focusing on her breath and letting go of those thoughts about the breakup. Or picture her putting all her guilt and regret into a box, locking it, and walking away feeling lighter and freer.
Wow, those are powerful images. Okay, what about Marie? She apologized to her friend, which is a huge step.
It is.
But I'm sure she's still carrying a lot of guilt.
Probably. And these steps can help her too. She could journal or talk to a therapist about why she shared the secret. Maybe she was feeling insecure or pressured. Understanding those factors can help her forgive herself.
So it's not about making excuses. It's about understanding her motivations.
Right. And she can also practice self-compassion, reminding herself that everyone makes mistakes, especially when emotions are running high.
And then she can focus on growth.
Yeah.
How can I be a better friend moving forward?
Exactly. And finally, she can use those letting go practices to release the guilt she's still holding on to.
This has been so insightful. I'm really starting to understand how important self-forgiveness is.
Me too. And remember, it's a journey. It's not something you do overnight. Be patient with yourself and you'll find that peace and wholeness.
I love that. This is so good. If you're enjoying this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe. Ready to wrap up this deep dive into self-forgiveness?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of really good stuff, but there are a couple more things I wanted to touch on.
Awesome. I'm all ears.
One thing is that forgiving yourself doesn't always mean forgetting what happened.
Yeah, that makes sense. Some things just stick with you.
Right. And sometimes those memories can still pop up even after you've done all the work to forgive yourself.
So what do you do about that?
Well, that's where reframing comes in. Instead of those memories being a source of shame, they can become reminders of how much you've grown.
Oh, I like that. So you're changing how you think about those memories.
Exactly. Every experience we have shapes who we are, even the bad ones.
And the mistakes we make can teach us valuable lessons.
Absolutely.
So it's about taking back control of those memories instead of letting them control you.
Right. Another important aspect of self-forgiveness is setting healthy boundaries.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I think a lot of us feel guilty when we say no to people, even when we know we should.
And sometimes that guilt comes from letting ourselves be treated poorly or taken advantage of.
So learning to set boundaries is a way to protect ourselves from those situations.
Exactly. When you set boundaries, you're saying, I deserve to be treated with respect.
And that can really boost your self-esteem.
It can. Okay, so we've talked about reframing memories and setting boundaries. Any other words of wisdom?
Oh, definitely. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it.
Yes, that's so important. Self-forgiveness can be really challenging, and sometimes we need support.
Like a therapist, a counselor, or even a close friend.
Right. Sometimes just talking to someone about what you're going through can make all the difference.
It can be really helpful to have that outside perspective. And it also reminds you that you're not alone in this.
Exactly. So if you're struggling, please reach out for support.
I think this has been a really great deep dive. I've learned so much about self-forgiveness.
Me too. And I hope our listeners have too.
It's really an ongoing process.
It is. It's about being kind and patient with yourself.
And recognizing that we all make mistakes.
We do, but we can learn and grow from them.
Well said. All right, deep divers, That's a wrap on our exploration of self-forgiveness. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.